So thank you for joining us today. And I want to welcome you to the Expert Series presentation from the Sashbear Foundation. I'm Carol Moffat, and I am a longtime volunteer with the Sashbear Foundation and a family member who has been helped by their various programs. And I'm excited to be here. I mean, because who doesn't want to learn how to have a happier and healthier life? I think we all want to do that. The Sashbear Foundation is a charitable organization recognized nationally and internationally as a leader for families impacted by emotion dysregulation, suicidality, and related mental health challenges. Joining me tonight are Barb and Kathleen. They also both volunteer for Sashbear in many different ways. And tonight they are the magic making this happen for us all. So I am grateful that they're here to help us to make this happen. And we'll be chatting with you in the background as well. So this presentation tonight is in webinar format. So what that means is your cameras are off and your mics are muted. So don't worry about how you look. Don't worry about if the dogs are barking, the kids are making noise. It's all good. We can't hear you. I've bribed my dogs tonight, so hopefully they will be quiet while I'm talking. They love Sashbear because it's always good treats on Sashbear night. The presentation is being recorded, so if you need to step away, it's going to be available on the website and our YouTube channel. And if you're like me, sometimes I like to go back and watch them again, and I typically pick up something that I missed the first time, so it is going to be available. Finally, we will have time for a few questions after our guest speaker completes their presentation. However, they will only be able to answer a certain number of questions. So in order to do that, we'd like you to put your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat. I want to make sure I get this right. If you put your questions in the Q&A, you have the option of posting it anonymously. And of course, anything you post in the chat or the Q&A will not be part of the recording. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer all of the questions, but we will ask Bobbie to address those that are relevant to her topic and that will meet the needs of the general audience, the most folks. So keep that in mind when you're submitting your questions. She's not going to be able to talk about, specific situations that are unique to you and your family only. Before we get started tonight, I want to thank all the participants in the multiple Sashbear walks that we just recently had in Canada. The Sashbear Walk is the largest event of its kind for borderline personality disorder, raising awareness and reducing stigma to help ensure everyone has the skills and support for a life worth living. The walk also serves as a fundraiser to help the Sashbear continue providing programs such as Family Connections and this webinar series. I am really excited to share over $200,000 was raised with over 1,000 participants coming together to create awareness from Burnaby, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland. If you did not have an opportunity to participate or donate, you can always go to the website to make a donation, and you can plan for the walk in the spring of 2025. With all that said, thank you again for your patience and for joining us tonight. And I'd like to now introduce our guest speaker to you, Bobbie Breckenridge. Bobbie is a registered social worker and mind-body coach with a decade of experience in community development and holistic wellness. Her commitment to co-creating a better world is evident through her work in organizing initiatives that foster genuine connection and promote well-being for all. Bobbie utilizes her skills in community development, event planning, program development, project management, and workshop facilitation to support GenWell's mission of building a more connected Canada. She is dedicated to lifelong learning and continuously engages in professional development to enhance her expertise. Bobbie's journey through personal healing has empowered her to support others in overcoming their own challenges. She is passionate about helping individuals reclaim their power, pleasure, and purpose, and is devoted to weaving a new legacy of wellness within her community. Tonight, Bobbie will share the importance of human connection for our health and happiness, especially in our increasingly disconnected post-pandemic world. That's a mouthful, I gotta say. Um, we will learn practical ways to enhance our social health, understanding the adverse effects of loneliness, and discover the benefits of building more meaningful connections. Without further ado, welcome, Bobbie. We're thrilled to have you with us tonight. Over to
Thank you
you.
so much, Carol, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'd love to hear your voices in the chat and just hear where you're calling in from and maybe what you're most looking forward to getting out of today. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you all. Love to see the hearts coming in. It's always so good. Beautiful. And can I get confirmation that you can see all of this?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you, Barb. All right. Welcome, everyone. I feel so grateful to be here with you all, especially as this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I love everything Sashbear is doing, as I also come from a family and a background with a lot of mental health stuff going on. So to be here with you all tonight to explore how we can create happier and healthier lives for ourselves while we show up for the people we care about is so meaningful to me. And I think this conversation has never been more relevant, especially as we find ourselves in this post pandemic world where we're increasingly disconnected from ourselves and from each other. And I think you'll find that usually these webinars are either about how we can kind of better take care of ourselves while we're taking care of others, or how we can better show up for the other people in our lives. But tonight, we're actually going to explore both of these at the same time. Because human connection doesn't just have the power to support the people around you, but it also has the power to support you as a multifaceted human being who wears many different social hats throughout the day. So let's dive in. And I'm going to invite you to take an action right now to start building more connection in your life. And I'm actually going to give you permission to do something that you don't normally get to do during a presentation. And that's actually to pull your phone out. And I'm going to ask you to think about someone that you've been meaning to reach out to, and maybe for whatever reason, just haven't had the energy or time or capacity to do so. And I want you to send them a quick text message right now to check in with them and see when they're available to connect or get together. And at the end of the presentation, we're actually going to come back and see what the responses were, because our research shows that a casual text makes a huge difference to the people in our lives, and that we actually significantly underestimate how much other people appreciate it when we reach out to them. So I'm going to give you a moment to finish that up and now send that text at the end of the presentation. As I said, we will be checking in to kind of see the response we got back. It's always one of my favorite activities. And once you're done with that, I invite you to put your phone back away so we don't get distracted for the rest of the presentation. And we'll check in later. And I know Lauren did such a beautiful job presenting me today and sharing all my shiny credentials with you all. But I really wanted to connect with you on a deeper level, not just as a professional, but as a real living, breathing, messy human being who has experienced the heartbreak of chronic loneliness that actually comes with mental health problems, as well as the life-changing benefits of human connection. So as you can see up on the screen, not only am I just a registered social worker and mind body coach and the community development manager here at GenWell, but I am also a dear friend, aunt, lover, musical junkie, and I do happen to carry a 4-liter emotional support bottle around with me that you will probably see me drinking from tonight, that often both impresses and intimidates other people. But more importantly than that, and perhaps like many of you in the room tonight, I actually come to this work through my lived experience. You see, I kind of grew up in and out of the system after surviving a pretty hellish childhood. And it was actually through the connections that I was able to form with my counselors, social workers, teachers, and other random beautiful people in my community that I was able to build the network I needed to leave that unhealthy living situation and actually begin to build the skills that I would need to be healthy and well enough to even be here with you all tonight to share this message. So, whether you're like me and you come to this work through knowing what it feels like to feel deeply alone, or whether you've been surrounded by love and support from family and friends, I hope you walk away from this presentation feeling even more inspired by the potential of human connection to change your life. Because in a world where we find ourselves increasingly faced with uncertainty, chaos, and division, this message is universal. And it's that we all need one another, and we can all be a part of a solution to building a more connected Canada. Which is why here at GenWell, Canada's Human Connection Movement, we've been on a mission since 2016 to address the issues of social isolation, disconnection, and loneliness through the power of human connection in order to generate wellness for all. And we do that by educating, empowering, and catalyzing Canadians around the importance of face to face social connection as a proactive step that we can all take for our personal and collective well being. And we're trying to engage 40 million Canadians in this conversation so that everyone can be more conscious about their social health and more intentional about building healthy connection habits. And as a preventative, positive, and inclusive connection based movement, as opposed to a mental health campaign, we're really here to teach people how their social health can actually improve their physical and mental well being, which is so important at this time because over 50% of Canadians feel lonely on a regular basis. And 30% of older adults in our community are at a risk of social isolation. And one pre pandemic study actually showed that up to 76% of employees found it difficult to build relationships at the office, which, of course, has only gotten more complicated through and post pandemic. As well, another study showed that over 70% of students at universities and colleges said they felt lonely on a regular basis. And we now know that research is showing that young people are some of the most affected when it comes to feeling lonely and isolated in our community. So, as you can see, this is an issue that's genuinely affecting everyone. But the good news is that the world is waking up. In 2018, the UK announced a minister and campaign to end loneliness. Places around the world like Australia, Japan, the Netherlands, and the US have all declared national strategies to address this issue. And the World Health Organization has actually recently created a commission to address the loneliness crisis around the world. But despite that, Canada still actually has no national strategies to address the loneliness crisis, which goes to show that while awareness is kind of waking up and people are waking up to this issue, awareness is not enough, and that we need to continue to advocate for national strategies and funding to create more sustainable social programming for us all. But more importantly than that, we also need to remember that building more connected communities is always going to start with us, which is why here at GenWell, we focus on empowering individuals to change not only their lives, but the lives of the people around them through the simple, small actions that we take every day to build connections. We also offer and act as a permission slip and kind of a reminder that the solutions to loneliness don't always have to be so complicated, and that sometimes it can be the simplest thing, like sending a text to someone you've been meaning to reach out to and get connected with, that can make all the difference in the world. So, I'd love to explore three key messages with you all tonight. And the first is that after the disconnection we just experienced through the pandemic, we are all vulnerable in this post pandemic world. And that experts have actually suggested that this increased disconnection that we've experienced has largely contributed to the growing mental and physical health crisis that we find ourselves in, and has really contributed to our struggle to be resilient during these times. But despite how potentially overwhelming and hopeless the last few years may have felt for all of us, that social connection is actually the superpower that we all have that helps us cope, find creative solutions, and build the resiliency we need to address these problems. So, truly, your efforts to get connected for yourself, for your loved ones, for your families has never made more of a difference to society as a whole. Because while we now may live in what's technically considered the most technologically connected society we've ever seen, the reality that you can see from those statistics I shared before is that we are actually living in the most fast paced, distracted, and pressure filled environment that we could ever find ourselves in, where many of us feel increasingly disconnected from ourselves and each other. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is many people think that we created it during the pandemic, but the reality is we've actually been teaching about this since 2016 because this isn't a recent issue at all, but something that's actually been growing since about the mid 1960s. And Robert Putnam wrote this really amazing book called Bowling Alone, where he began to track this trend that emerged out of the 1950s, where we saw that people began to engage less with their communities and in their civic life and focused more on chasing what I call kind of quote unquote the American dream. So, what happened during that time from the 1960s onwards? Well, people stopped spending time with the people they loved and they started focusing on building bigger houses for smaller families, taller fences, backyard decks instead of front porches, and automatic garage door openers, and at home movie theaters where we're literally now at a point where we would never have to leave our house for something if we didn't want to. And I think lately we've been slowly waking up to the fact that this entire time we thought we were building our castles, we've actually been building our jail cells. And yet we wonder why we've been all feeling so alone and isolated and unhappy. Well, that's because this is a far way off from caveman times, where we actually worked together in order to provide for our basic needs. And we understood on a literal biological level that as a mammal or a pack animal, we're literally wired for connection in order to survive. And we spent most of our times in our communities to provide for those basic needs, things like food and shelter and water, but also those deeper human needs of love and acceptance, of belonging, of entertainment and safety and trust. So while the challenges of today look very different than they used to, we need to remember that our brains and bodies are still biologically wired for connection, not just to survive, but in order to thrive. Because human connection actually transcends all illnesses, all causes, and all crisis. And it reconnects us to the heart of who we truly are and what it is we truly need in order to be well and happy as human beings, which is each other. So, what are we working to overcome in this disconnected society then? Well, I think many of us in this room probably understand that loneliness is a very subjective experience. But I think many of us haven't been taught what causes loneliness or how it differs from social isolation and disconnection. So we now know that it's not just about being socially isolated, which is where we have very few social contacts around us, but you could actually be surrounded by people and still not feel like you belong or like you're accepted as part of the group. And that's where we experience a lot of disconnection. But more than that, we might not even be happy with the quality of the relationships we have in comparison to the relationships we desire. And this can be especially difficult when, we love someone so deeply who's struggling with something and they just can't show up for us maybe in the ways we're desiring at the time. And it's that kind of disconnect between what we're desiring in our relationships and what we're receiving in our relationships that can create that sense of loneliness. So, who can feel lonely then? Well, I think as you saw at the start of our presentation with all of those statistics, it's actually all of us. Every single person can feel lonely at some point of their lives. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations. Because once we actually realize that we're all struggling with feeling alone and disconnected in this world, like we don't quite belong or we're not quite accepted, we wake up to the solution of social connection as the way that we can proactively build those connections that we need in order to stay happy and healthy. But in order to do that, at first, we need to even admit that we're feeling lonely and that we're all struggling with that sense of feeling alone. But unfortunately, many of us don't even want to admit that that's something we feel because, on top of it being a very uncomfortable feeling and sensation, there are so many negative narratives attached to that, right? Stories like, I'm not good enough, I'm too much, I'm a freak, I'll never belong, I'm unlovable, etc., etc. Those are the stories that cause us so much pain. But in order to reduce the stigma and the shame associated with loneliness, we need to understand what loneliness actually is and what it's not. And what it's not is all those stories that I just shared that we tend to attach to those experiences of loneliness. But what loneliness actually really is simply a signal from the body and the brain that we're needing more connection and meaningful interactions with others. And it's actually the same signal that our body and brain sends to us when we're thirsty, we're hungry, or we're tired. And because we understand that those are just innate human needs, we feel no guilt about knowing that if we feel that way, if we eat our food, if we drink our water, we go to sleep, we're going to feel better, right? And so part of the reason why loneliness is becoming a chronic physical and mental health issue is because we're not addressing it and receiving and going out and getting more social connection when we feel lonely. And just in the same way, we would get super sick if we stopped eating, drinking, or going to sleep. Of course, if we don't get connected with people for a prolonged period of time, it's going to turn into a chronic or more persistent physical and mental health issue. So I know some of you in the audience might be sitting here and being like, well, this is all well and good, Bobbie, but I'm an introvert, so this doesn't really apply to me. But the truth is, it does, because as mammals or pack animals, we do all need each other. It's just that introverts tend to need social connection maybe a little bit less often in smaller groups and more controlled settings. I know for me personally, I'd much rather have an intimate dinner with a friend than go to like a big party or big groups of people. So, really, at the end of the day, you just have to figure out what's going to work best for you and build your relationships and your connection activities around that. So let's actually explore what human connection even is. And quite simply put, it's just the exchange between two or more people that are paying attention to one another in some way. And that could be as simple as just a wave, a smile, or a head nod, all the way up to a full blown conversation with someone. But more important than the actual interaction we're having is the sense of acceptance and belonging, of safety and trust, and that mutual support and shared value that we get when we're in connection with others. And it's those feelings that help contribute to good social health. And social health is really our ability to positively and proactively interact with, build, and maintain meaningful relationships with other people. And when we look at social health, we really want to look at a few key factors. First and foremost, we want to look at the number of relationships you have and the different types. We want to look at the frequency of the interactions you're having, as well as, and kind of most importantly, the perceived quality of your connections with other people. And finally, we want to look at how to build those social skills that'll allow you to communicate with others and navigate social situations and social roles with more ease and grace. So, why is social health so important? Well, we now know that it's a bigger determinant of health than obesity, smoking, and high blood pressure. And yet, historically, social health has been left out of the conversation when we explore self care, health, and wellness, which is really interesting when you think about that. We've been educated in some instances for over 50 years on the importance of healthy eating, of exercise, of not drinking, of smoking, of getting a good night's sleep, and even now moving into like mindfulness practices and all of that. And yet, we've never really looked at social health even though we know it's one of the most proactive and best ways that we can actually positively contribute to better mental and physical health and well-being. So now that we kind of understand the definitions of social health, human connection, loneliness, isolation, and disconnection, let's take a look at how loneliness actually impacts people across the lifespan, starting with our youth. And actually knowing that research now shows that young people are actually some of the most affected now when it comes to feelings of loneliness and isolation. And I'll let you take a look up on the screen and see some of the statistics of how loneliness impacts youth's health. But what some of the things I think are most important here is we have to understand that at their most critical time of development, a lack of social connection can deeply impact their executive functioning, their brain development, and their health outcomes over the lifespan. Such as, and again, you can read some of the stats on here, but some of the most important ones that I've seen or I pick out for adults' health is, increasing your risk of death by up to 45%, as well as increasing a whole risk of other issues such as stroke, heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, as well as a large increased risk of anxiety and depression. But loneliness also has a lot of negative impacts on society as a whole. We know that it can increase the risk of hospitalization by 68%, as well as an increased risk of emergency room visits by 57%. A really interesting study that just came out of the UK actually estimates that it costs on average about $10,000 per person per year due to its combined impact on people's health, well being, and work productivity. We also know that it now causes a buildup of chemicals in the brain that increases stress, aggression, and fear, and can ultimately lead to more forms of extremism and violence in our communities, which can lead us to feeling very unsafe in this world and in these times as we see this increasing polarization among people in our communities. And so I'd love to pause here and see if there were any surprises or, anything that you were really like, wow, I didn't know that or that impacted me. So feel free to just share in the chat kind of what came up for you. Um, and what you're experiencing so far. I know it's always mind-blowing for me when I see those statistics. I mean, I've read this so many times at this point, and every time I see the impact on the statistics of what loneliness actually does to our health, I'm like, whoa. So yeah, feel free to share. I'm going to take a sip of water. And if there are no comments, I'm going to invite us into some reflection questions now. So feel free to grab a journal or a pen or anything that's close by for you in order to capture your thoughts on this. And the first question that I'd like you to answer is, how has this discussion changed your understanding of loneliness and its effects on your health and well-being? Number two, what challenges do you face in addressing loneliness and disconnection in your life? And number three, what is one simple action you can take to build more support for yourself and those you care for? And so I'm going to give us a couple minutes now to just journal on those. And if you need more time, that's all good. You can maybe take a picture and come back. And I'll make sure that you guys have these reflection questions for afterwards as well. And I'm going to stop my screen share for a second and put on some music. Let's share my sound. Beautiful. Let's all back to the presentation. Thank you all for that. Now, I know we just spent a lot of time exploring some of the difficulties that we're facing in our society right now and looking at some of those negative health consequences of loneliness. But because I never like to leave the room on a downer, we're actually going to go ahead and explore the benefits of social connection now, which I think you will see are vast and far reaching. Number one, it's actually the single largest indicator of happiness in our lives. And this comes out of the 80-year Harvard study done by Dr. Waldinger, which I think is one of the first times we really started to see and understand how important social connection actually is for our health and well-being. Number two, it increases your chances of living longer by up to 50%, which is pretty wild when you think about it. It strengthens your immune system and can actually help reduce inflammation in the body, which is one of the biggest risk factors when we look at developing a chronic illness. And it actually keeps all parts of your brain active and healthy and able to fight off infection. It's one of the most powerful actions that we can take to prevent and treat anxiety. And it's actually the single largest preventative action we can take to avoid depression. And at a time where we're seeing all-time high diagnoses of anxiety and depression, I think this is huge, especially when we consider the fact that on average, we have between 50 to 75,000 thoughts per day, of which 80% of those thoughts are negative and 95% of them are repetitive. So social connection literally is the magic tool we can use to get out of our own heads, disrupt those negative thought patterns, and build a more accurate perception of ourselves through the eyes of people who love us and know us well. Can also increase your self-confidence, which at a time when we're seeing all-time highs of social anxiety, that is super amazing. And it can actually help you build the social skills you need in order to boost your sense of self-esteem and self-worth and feel like you actually have the resources, tools, and supports you need to navigate challenges in more easeful and graceful ways, which can ultimately help increase your empathy, compassion, and resiliency, which of course is so important when we're living with people who have and struggle with serious mental health issues. You know, this really is a secret sauce that we can use to support us in cultivating that capacity to hold that empathy while also meeting our own needs through connections that will, light us up, fill our cups, and allow us to show up with more care, more resources, and more ability to hold that compassion. And also at a time in the world where we're, facing increasing disconnection and separation from different political, cultural, social, and socioeconomic divides, human connection literally can help us judge each other less and understand each other more. And as we understand these different perspectives in the world, it actually helps strengthen our ability to collaborate with others and create creative solutions to address these issues, which ultimately, at the end of the day, also helps us reduce prejudice and discrimination in our societies, which of course is a major cause of the violence and disconnection and division that we're seeing right now in the world. So imagine now with me for a moment that there's a new drug on the market that literally increases your chances of survival by as much as 50%, can actually reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, developing dementia, and actually increases your immune functioning and well-being. And there's literally zero negative side effects. Would you want to try that drug? Because I mean, I definitely know I would. And so, again, I'd love to pause here and see if there were any more surprises or anything that really stood out to you. I'm really looking forward to reading the chat later, guys. I'm not gonna lie. Would love to hear what stood out for you. Um, and yeah, if anything really was like, wow, I didn't know that. So for the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. But again, as I said, I'm definitely going to be reading the chat as these come in and through the Q&A. So please share your lovely thoughts with me. Um, And now I really kind of want to address and share that while there are so many benefits to human connection and it can be such medicine for us, that I think there's probably many of us in the room who have also experienced it as poison sometimes because, it can hurt. Human connection can hurt, and it can also be the most life-changing, beautiful, magical thing in the world. But the reality is, especially over the last 3 years, we've been living in almost a chronic state of stress, overwhelm, anxiety, and uncertainty. Um, and it's taken a toll on our brains and bodies, and it has made us very, very tired. And we're working really hard to adjust to this new normal. And we know that when we're stressed and we're experiencing stress, that the parts of our brain that are actually wired for connection, for rejuvenation, and for higher cognitive functioning begin to shut down. So, of course, when we're faced with this crazy pandemic where we can no longer connect with other people, we're going to start to develop coping strategies and mechanisms that actually make us more disconnected as a protective way to try to deal with all the stress, anxiety, and overwhelm that we were dealing with. And so, in a similar way that if we didn't go to the gym for 3 years and then we started working out again, we might feel like a bit uncomfortable and sore and tired. We're going to feel the same way with social connection, especially as we learn to rebuild those connections that actually fill our cups up, nourish us, and help us feel that resiliency we need to keep going through these difficult times. Because the reality is, and as I just shared, the connections that fill us up aren't back to normal yet. And our research had actually shown that pre-pandemic, 60% of the interactions that we had with other people weren't actually with people we were intending to see that day. And it was through those like small interactions we had with people on the daily basis while we were out and about living our lives that really filled us up and made us feel a sense of connection to each other and to our communities. Because we know that those social connections are so important. As I said, we're mammals, we're pack animals, we're wired for connection. And so, of course, a lack of social connection is going to be one of the largest contributors to burnout in our lives, which is definitely a big issue when we're navigating really challenging circumstances with our loved ones and doing our best to show up and be there for them, but also probably really struggling to receive the connection and the support that we're also needing in order to show up in those ways. Which is why it's so much more important for us to be intentional and conscious about rebuilding these connections that nourish us and give us hope and help us cope with these challenges in more resilient ways. Especially because we know there are very specific connection challenges that, we experience when we're supporting people with mental health issues. First and foremost, there can really be a big role strain and a lack of support. Some of us are navigating being parents, working, also trying to be a wife or a family member or a support person, as well as have friends and family time. And there's just so many roles and responsibilities on us on a daily basis that can be really hard to make time and to create those connections that will fill us up. And more importantly, we can feel a real lack of support in our circles, especially when, sometimes showing up means it feels like we can end up neglecting our own needs, our own wants, our own desires and connection. And so that can be a really tricky thing to navigate. when we experience that. We also know that there's a big issue around compassion fatigue and burnout. It's emotionally fatiguing work, especially when we love someone and we witness them struggle. That can take a really big toll on us and eventually lead to burnout where we might become more apathetic or frustrated. We might also feel a lot of guilt and shame for how we're feeling. Um, and just lead to this host of feeling very, yeah, tired and burnt out and apathetic at a time where we really want to show up for our people in big and meaningful ways. We also know that there's still so much stigma surrounding mental health, that it can be hard to like receive that support. And more than that, we're going through our own grieving process, right? Of being in connection with people who are suffering and holding that while also holding all of our own feelings and experiences that are going on. And when finally that can lead to a lot of, work-life balance issues where maybe we feel like we have less time to be in rest and to take care of ourselves. And as compassionate people who love our loved ones and who want to support, sometimes we can get so caught up in being there for them that we neglect ourselves. Which is why, as I said, it's so, so important for us to be even more intentional around building strong social networks that can actually hold and support us while we're holding and supporting the people we love. And ultimately, we need to understand that this is going to take some time and that we need to be really patient and gentle with ourselves and each other as we learn to reconnect. And we understand that some people might not be ready. We know that a lot of people are actually still fearful of COVID or actually passing COVID on to people with autoimmune issues. We now know more people claim to be socially anxious and feeling shy after the pandemic. So, truly, we need to just be very gentle with ourselves as we relearn how to connect with each other in safe and meaningful ways. And ultimately, we need to remember that we're all in this together. As I said at the start of the presentation, we're all struggling with feeling alone. It's been a crazy ride for all of us. And as we understand that, we understand that we're not alone in how we're feeling. And more than that, when we actually come together, we have these conversations. We remember that we do have the power to make a difference and to shift this by just being open with each other and speaking about this and being vulnerable and ultimately realizing that it's through these simple actions that we can take every day, like sending a check-in text to someone or waving to someone on the street or giving a small compliment, that really begins to reweave that fabric of community that we are so desperately craving and desiring. And so now that we've explored kind of, ways that been more challenging to connect through the pandemic and post-pandemic, let's actually start to explore where we can build more of our social connections. And a lot of this comes out of our Canadian Social Connection Survey, which we run every year and actually is going to inform the first ever Canadian Social Connection Guidelines. That'll be very similar to like healthy eating guidelines that'll actually be coming out in 2025. So very excited for that and keep your eyes peeled. And what our research and research by Dr. Dunbar out of the UK has shown is that the most important thing we could do for our social health is to actually build a strong relationship with about 3 to 5 people that we feel deeply close to and like we could rely on if, shit hits the fan or things get bad. Um, From there, you'll see that we have 4 quadrants surrounding our Fab Four. And these are the relationships that we build with our family, our friends, our neighbors, and our classmates and colleagues. Now, what's really important to note here is that we really want to try our best to build strong relationships in each of these 4 quadrants that if we experience a life transition, like, we lose our job or we break up with a partner, that we have other relationships that we can lean on through those times of transition. And finally, you'll see that each of these four quadrants are surrounded by the random people that we come into contact with on a daily basis. And this is really beautiful because we know that a stranger today could end up becoming a friend tomorrow. And that the casual connections we have with people that we see when we're out on the bus or in the coffee shop, can refill our cups and ultimately end up potentially becoming deeper connections in our life. Because truly, the opportunities to connect are actually all around us once we open up to the possibilities. So let's actually explore each of these in a little bit more detail. It's no surprise that our family and our friends have the ability to make us feel less lonely and more connected, as these are probably going to be the people who make up our Fab Four. But we also know that these can be the connections where we experience a lot of pain and struggle. I know for me, family was always a big one. And so that's why it's really important to build those other quadrants out so that we have strong social circles, regardless of the connections we have with kind of those closer, more intimate relationships. So let's explore the power of neighbors. Our research shows that people who spend at least 1 to 4 hours a week with their neighbors are actually 3 times less lonely than those who don't. And we also know that people tend to feel like they have more support if they needed it. Like if you got locked out or, you just needed something, it's really nice to know that you have a neighbor there that you could call. But we also know that most people don't know their neighbors, and that pre pandemic research showed that only 50% of Canadians actually knew their next door neighbor's first name. So, if that is you, this is definitely an invitation to introduce yourself at some point and strike up a connection. We know that people who talk to strangers at least once a week are actually 3 times happier than people who don't. We also know that this can be a great source of support, especially when we're in caregiving roles where, again, maybe it's not so easy for us to talk to our other friends and family members about what's going on. Webinars like this or grief circles or things like that can be really supportive. And I know this has actually been a really big growth edge for me. And as I've actually started talking to more strangers, like my Uber drivers and things like that, I've really noticed how much safer and connected I feel in my society. So, if that's a growth edge for you, I'm inviting you to also kind of play around with that and see what's possible. And finally, the power of colleagues and classmates. Our research actually shows that these relationships are actually just as impactful on our sense of happiness and connection as the relationships we have with our family and friends. We also know that people who had a work best friend are actually 7 times more productive than people who don't. And so, really, truly, these are some of the most impactful relationships we have in our lives. Because when we enjoy the people we work with and we enjoy the work we do, it actually positively impacts every other relationship that we have. So, we need to remember to lean on each other during these times, especially as we find ourselves increasingly, disconnected through this technologically connected world. We now know that we actually spend on average over 9 hours a day on our technology. And we also know that in person conversation activates more parts of our brain, almost like 9 times to 1 as compared to a digital conversation. We also know that in person communications are far more likely to drive outcomes and impacts than online conversations are. So let's remember to use our technology and leverage it as a support to make more human connection and social connections instead of distracting us and creating less. Because at the end of the day, there are so many benefits to human connection for all of us as we take care of the people we love. Whether that's reducing depression by 50% and our anxiety by 30%, increasing our collaboration by 10%, and increasing our supports and our resource sharing, which ultimately increases our resiliency, as well as reducing our risk of chronic illness, increasing our life satisfaction on longevity, and actually lowering our perceived burden of supporting others, and ultimately allowing us to build better relationships with other people through developing those social skills which ultimately will improve the quality of life for everyone in your life. Because it makes the work that we do and the ways that we care and show up for our people less transactional, more enjoyable, and more inclusive. And it's something that we can leverage in every aspect of our life, as I said at the start of this presentation, whether that's for yourself and your loved ones, for the relationships you begin to build with your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers and classmates, or those casual collisions that you meet and experience every day, or whether that's the relationships you begin to build with bigger organizations and support systems like Sashbear, as well as the advocacy and relationship building that we have with and for all people on national and global levels by coming together and saying, hey, we actually need one another to address these issues and to support developing, the solutions we're going to need to create a more connected world. So really, truly, I ask you, is there anyone here who wouldn't actually benefit from more connections in your personal and professional lives? Knowing that we know now. So again, I'd love to give you a few minutes to answer some reflection questions. And feel free to record them wherever's best. And if you want to come back to these later, definitely take a picture. First and foremost, I want you to actually reflect on your current social network and think about who are those key people that you can actually rely on for support and connection around you. And then I want you to think about where could you actually start to expand your social networks for more support. And finally, potentially most importantly, what is one simple action that you can take starting today to get connected? And honestly, the more simple, the better. So I'll give you a minute or two to answer that because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I'm going to take another sip of water. Beautiful. And for the interest of time, since we started late, I'm going to wrap that up. But again, please take a picture of it. I'll make sure to pass these along so that you have the reflection questions as well to answer later on. And I'd love to actually share with you my 5 tips for improved social health. Number one is you now actually know more than 90% of the Canadian population when it comes to social health. And you can actually use this knowledge to inspire others through having conversations about the power of human connection and how it can positively impact your physical and mental well being. Number two, very, very important. Please be intentional about your social health, calendar it in, and create routines. The reality is, y'all, we are so busy at this point and so overwhelmed that if we're not calendaring this in and we're not making routines around it, it's just not going to happen. And we know that often the times when we need social connection the most is when we're going to self-isolate the most. And so again, if it's in your calendar and you already have it cued in, that's going to hopefully prevent those situations of when you're feeling extra tired and burnt out and you have no energy. But you know that just like going to the gym or eating right, you'll feel better afterwards. You'll feel better after you connect with the people you care about. Number three, if you're kind of struggling with the social anxiety and you feel like after the pandemic, you've kind of lost your ability to converse with people, which I know I did, um, really start to practice those communication skills and active listening skills that will improve the quality of your relationships. Number four, recognize that everyone connects differently. So kind of figure out where you are on that introversion and extroversion scale. Kind of figure out where your people are and plan activities that are actually going to work for all of you. And number five, go first. Just like I had you today, just send that simple, quick check-in text. It can literally be just these small actions every day, like waving or saying hi and introducing yourself to your neighbor, that make all the difference in the world. So, if you're curious and you want to learn more, definitely check out our social health toolkit that we'll be sending out to all of you that dives way deeper into all of this and gives some extra tools, resources, and tips on how to get connected. You can also visit our website at genwell.ca to learn more about the programming we're doing for communities, workplaces, classrooms, and seniors, as well as the 6 catalytic campaigns that we run throughout the year to actually get people more connected. You can also participate in our social connection survey that's going on now till August, and every response helps us to do our work even better and to inform those guidelines that are going to actually inform how people should be getting connected in Canada. You could also participate in GenWell Weekend that's coming up this September 20th to 22nd, which is actually that excuse, reminder, and permission slip to just get connected with the people around you. So you can learn more about that at genwellweekend.org. You could also explore Talk to a Stranger Week coming up in November, which has actually become one of my favorite campaigns. So definitely check that out at talktostrangerweek.org. So let's just quickly review because I know we chatted about a lot today. Number one, we explored the history of disconnection in our world, as well as looked at defining what social connection, what social health is, and human connection is. Then finally, we looked at how loneliness impacts us throughout the lifespan. We then explored the benefits of social connection, as well as looked at where you can start to build more connections in your life. And I want to remind you that, again, after the disconnection of the pandemic and the ongoing struggles that we've all faced, that we're all feeling vulnerable and disconnected. And that experts have suggested that this increased disconnection from each other has largely contributed to the growing mental and physical health crisis that we find ourselves in and that ongoing struggle to be resilient. But despite how you might have been feeling the last few years, it's so important to remember that social connection literally is the superpower that we all have that helps us cope, find solutions, and build the resiliency we need in order to deal with these issues. And that your efforts to get connected face to face have literally never been more critical for society's health and well being because we need each other more than ever. And we're in this together. And the best medicine for people is people. So I invite you today to become a solution to the disconnected world that we live in and to remember that it's in the simplest actions we take that make all the difference in the world for our health and happiness. You are now an ambassador of the human connection movement, and your actions to get people connected can and do make a difference. Thank you. And so I'd love to check in and hear from the chat if anyone heard back from anyone. Please share their stories. And we'll open it up for the Q&A.
Great. Thanks very much. And lots of good information, lots of some pretty amazing statistics that you shared with us. So I'm going to go right back to kind of the beginning when you were talking about some definitions, where you went through the difference between social isolation versus loneliness versus being disconnected. One of the questions that came in was, and it kind of ties in with, I'm an introvert, so therefore I don't need as much, that kind of thing. Where does defining aloneness come into all of that? So how does that fit into all those definitions and someone choosing to be alone?
Yeah, so I would say so. First up, y'all, I work for a human connection movement. I am introverted. I'm very introverted. I need a certain amount of time every day to be with myself and decompress. So, what I'm going to say to you guys is it's not about being alone or disconnected from others. It's about coming back to connection with yourself, right? And it's that as you're able to sink into yourself and be with yourself first and foremost, you're going to have more energy and more capacity to then connect with other people. So again, figure out what works for you. I know personally, I can't do more than 3 social engagements in a week or I will get burnt out. And so that's what works for me. So kind of find out what works for you. Find that good balance. But know again, it's not necessarily you're disconnecting from other people, it's that you're reconnecting with yourself.
Right. I like that. Reconnecting with yourself, because in this crazy mad world, we need some time, alone time as well.
We
So I
do.
just want to let you know in the chat that we've got a few, because of that little mini exercise at the beginning. A few folks are going out for dinner in the near future.
Yay.
They are connecting. So yeah, that definitely we saw that working. The question is, how do you actually get started? So you talked a lot about reconnecting post pandemic, but how do you initiate those connections? So we've had a few questions about that, whether in a new job, especially younger people that are trying to navigate. It's a new job. I don't want to be too social, but I don't know anybody. Who do I go to ask for questions? And just moving. During the pandemic, we saw lots of people moving. So now, post pandemic, I am one of those people. It started just before the pandemic, but then did the move actually at the very start of the pandemic. And coming out of it, I'm in a community. I know nobody. That's not true. I moved to be closer to family. But still, there were a lot of moves, right? So now we're talking about, it's not about reconnecting, it's those new connections. How do new connections happen?
Yeah.
People aren't sure about how to kind of go about those.
That is a great question. I love this. It's actually something I work on a lot because, as I kind of shared with you guys, I didn't have a lot of the normal connections that most people get in their lives. And so I've had to work on like building those connections through finding new ones. And so there's lots of ways that you can go about it in terms of like, there's things like meetup.com where you can find hobbies and skills and things you're interested in. One of my favorite things, especially if you guys live in Toronto, is there's always new events that you can try to go out to and slowly like you'll start to see people there. Um, but it is going to take putting yourself out there. You are just going to have to like have conversations with people, find things you're interested in, maybe you go to conferences, anything like that. But I'd say maybe the deeper thing happening here is working on those social skills, the social skills to feel comfortable enough to initiate conversation with people, being able to like ask people questions. I've noticed starting conversations, people love when you ask them questions about like about themselves, you compliment them, and just like building those skills to feel more comfortable in yourself, to know who you are, to know what you like, to know what you don't like, to feel comfortable to go out, put yourself out there and actually just communicate with other people, right? Because that's how you find your people is you shine your little freak light and you're like, this is what I like and this is who I am. And the right people will be like, oh my God, I'm like that too. And I also like those things. Um, so yeah, I would say that, but again, like some of those it's kind of a unique question and that like we'd have to sit down and look at where you are personally and like where you could expand those circles, but in general, find out what you like, expand out there, go to events, put yourself out there, ask people questions and feel that self-confidence in yourself to know who you are and what you're looking for and like the right people will come to you. Um,
Right. Thank you. Okay, so everyone came along with, when we're talking about those health risks that leads to our loneliness, um, is that a result of people? It actually does affect the just being alone does affect the health, the physical health, or is it more a sense of neglect that goes with it? Because maybe I might not notice something about myself, but if I was more in social community, somebody else might notice me and say, you don't look well or something, in a kind way. But is that something that it's more of just a lot of neglectfulness that kind of goes with that loneliness? Or is there something else going on there with that physical health decline that we see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say it's nuanced in that there's a lot that's actually happening in the brain and the body. I'm a science nerd, so I took some of that out because I didn't want to bore you guys with like intense brain science. But what we do know is that on a biological level, when we're isolated or disconnected, like I want us to go back to that tribal time, right? Because as much as we've advanced in a lot of ways, our bodies are still mammals. And so that means like back in those days where we literally had to survive nature and like giant animals and bears and like crazy things to survive, our bodies were wired to need each other. So that's why when we like are genuinely alone or isolated and we're facing a problem, our stress goes through the roof. And when that stress response goes through the roof and the survival part of our brain activates, we know that higher level cognitive functioning shuts down. We know that the parts of the brain and body that are wired for rest, for rejuvenation, and for helping our body like digest our food, rest, relax, like all of that gets shut down. And over time, as that becomes persistent or chronic, the chronic stress, the chronic lack of feeling like you're never supported or no one's around or no one gets you and you're all by yourself, you got to figure out life all on your own. That's what's going to lead to that persistent physical health issue because inflammation in the body is going to rise. Your body's ability to handle like the stressors is going to go down. And then you're just flooded with those like hormones and chemicals that ultimately we're supposed to be there to help you, you know, navigate stressful situations like running away from a bear, but long term over time break the body down because the body can't actually ever get back into a rest and relaxation state. um yeah, I hope I answered that well.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So, how do we get out of, I'm going to call it, this is me talking, kind of ad-libbing here, but how do we shift from, coming out of post-pandemic, getting into a rut, and almost like now we're comfortable with that less amount of connection?
Yes.
I read one of the things here was somebody said, like, like I go for a walk with my dog. I'm good with that.
Hmm.
And like, where's that? Where is it that we cross that line where, we've accepted this new normal, we're comfortable with it, but are we in a rut? Or is it okay that we've reduced that level of connection? And so we're not going to have that same level of, physical or mental health impact because we've adapted. I'll say, yeah, maybe that's what I'm looking for is we've adapted to that reduced social connection level.
Yeah, that's actually an amazing question. Again, I think it's gonna vary depending who you kind of are. Um, but in general, I'd say, and I kind of said this when I spoke about the pandemic, is we have adapted in that we've gotten used to less connection. And in some ways, that's amazing. That's our bodies and brains trying to find a way to deal with this. But we also need to remember that we do need this. It's a same human need as like eating, sleeping, breathing,
Yeah.
food, shelter. It is very basic human need. And so again, we need to kind of play around with our capacity and what we're comfortable with because it also is going to take some capacity building to get back to that. But I also kind of, it feels important here to give a reminder for our young ones and for the generations to come and what type of world do we want them to inherit? Because we're seeing young people right now who struggle to even say hello to someone or make eye contact or get on a phone call. Is that the world that we want them to inherit? So even if we're like, yeah, I'm cool, I'm just going to walk my dog, hang out at my house, like watch Netflix and all of that, what is that impact going to be for the rest of people and for the future generations? Because if we keep going that way, there's going to be very significant impact for all of us. And so, even if it's small things like when you're walking your dog, just making eye contact with someone and saying hello, it's those teeny things that are going to keep the fabric of our communities stronger, which we're going to need to address these issues that we're facing today. So even if it's not necessarily for you, maybe that person that you just walked by with their dog, they needed that hello. Maybe that's the only human connection they got that day, and you never know the difference it can make.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to end it there, and I'm going to ask that you put up that last slide again with GenWell, because I think that was really important for people to follow up for those other resources of where they can, kind of follow up, and can learn more about the human connection. And just on behalf of all the participants, and there's a lot of us, I think a couple of people have dropped off because we starting late. We hit their time allotment that they had. But thank you so much for sharing how we can, you know, get connected, reconnect. The importance of that social connection that we all need, even if we don't think we might need it at times. But just that significance and how it plays in our life. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here with me. It was such an honor to be with you all tonight, and I hope you feel inspired to get more connected.
I just looking at the chat, a lot of people have connected, and there's going to be a lot of connections happening in the near future with this group. So I think that little text at the beginning has spawned a lot more going forward. So that's great.
So
So
beautiful.
everyone enjoy those dinners and lunches and social gatherings that you're going to be going to in the near future. Thanks again, Bobbie. Appreciate it.